This is one of those revenge stories revolving around the theme of family drama. The end of the story will bring you a big surprise and unforgettable emotions. If you like these stories of injustice and unexpected reversals, please like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any interesting videos. They said I was too emotional, too idealistic, too female to handle the family business. Yet I was the one holding the deeds when they tried to lock me out. The last time I stepped foot in the Carter family boardroom, I was 26 and sobbing. My voice cracked as I begged them not to push me aside. Sandra, my stepmother, leaned back in her chair, smiled, and said, "Sweetheart, this isn't personal. It's just business." That's when I realized that to them, I was never part of the plan. I was the detour they wanted to forget. But 7 years can change everything, especially when you learn how to fight on your terms. Before delving into this story full of betrayal, erased identities, and quiet revenge, let me know where you're watching from, and hit like if you've ever been underestimated, only to come back stronger. The message came in a plain white envelope with no return address. Inside, a printed obituary clipped from the Hill County Times. Thomas Carter, 68, passed peacefully at home. No mention of surviving children, no service details, no note. It hit me like a sucker punch. I hadn't heard from anyone in that house for 7 years. Not on holidays, not on my birthday, not even when I launched my restaurant group last year, a story that made the Austin Chronicle. I should have known then they didn't just forget me. They erased me. But grief is strange. It doesn't matter how angry you are. I sat alone at my kitchen table with the clipping pressed flat between my fingers, blinking at the words like they might change if I stared long enough. My father was gone, and they didn't even bother to tell me. I called the number I still remembered by heart. The landline at the ranch. It rang once and twice, then went to voicemail. The Carter residence. Please leave a message. The same voice. The Sandra's. It's still smooth as cream over gravel. I didn't leave a message. Instead, I booked a one-way ticket to Waco, packed a single carry-on, and left my apartment before dawn. I didn't even tell my assistant I was going. I just went. I hadn't stepped foot in that part of Texas since I walked away from Carter Agritech with nothing but a severance check and a warning not to come back. When I arrived at the gates of the Carter Ranch, everything looked the same but colder. The gravel road was raked. The grass was cut short. Too clean. Too polished. The soul was gone. I walked up to the porch like a stranger, suitcase in hand. And that's exactly how they treated me. Sandra opened the door in a pressed black dress, pearls at her throat. No tears, just a practiced tilt of the head. "Chloe," she said, voice like dry silk. "We weren't expecting you," clearly I replied. Behind her, I could see the hallway where I learned to ride my tricycle, the chandelier my mother chose before cancer took her. And just beyond that, my old room, now repainted pale gray door, closed, a faint smell of fresh paint leaking out. "Your room's being used for storage now," Sandra added quickly. "But we can set you up in the guest house. The same one they used for hired help." Before I could answer, a man stepped into the foyer, Trevor, Sandra's son. He was wearing my father's Rolex. My father's Rolex. He smirked when he saw me. "We were just about to meet with the lawyer," he said. "You probably don't need to be here for that." I said nothing. But inside, something snapped back into place. Not anger. Not even grief. Clarity. They thought they could erase me. They were about to learn I came back with more than a suitcase, and I wasn't leaving empty-handed. The door creaked shut behind me with a finality that sent a chill through my spine. The foyer smelled like fresh-cut flowers and new money, artificial, precise. It's like a stage set. But nothing about this was make-believe. Not the way Sandra's voice hardened when she said guest house. Not the way Trevor looked me up and down like I didn't belong. As I walked past the grand staircase, memories flashed through my mind like snapshots. That banister where I used to slide down in sock feet. The wall where Dad hammered in our height marks is now painted over with trendy gray. just like my old room. It was gone. All of it. And in its place was a carefully curated version of the Carters that didn't include me. Trevor followed close behind, his smirk growing louder with every step. "You still driving that old Civic?" he asked. "Sandra's getting me a Tesla next month. Says it suits my role better." I bit my tongue. It wasn't just the words, it was the glee in his tone, the triumph of someone who believed they'd already won. At the kitchen table sat two people I didn't recognize, sipping coffee like they owned the place. One of them, a woman in a sleek suit, gave me a curt nod and went back to flipping through papers. "The lawyer will be here at noon," Sandra said, glancing at her watch. "We'll just need your signature on a few forms, Chloe. You know, to keep things tidy." "Forms?" I asked. "Estate matters. Just paperwork. Of course we assumed you wouldn't want to be involved in management." Management. The word hung in the air like a bad smell. I turned toward the back window, my gaze landing on the barn. My barn. Where I spent summers hauling hay and learning the books of Carter Agritech before I was old enough to vote. Dad and I built a feed storage system from scratch. He used to call me his numbers girl. But now Sandra had claimed everything right down to the nickname. "Trevor will be taking the reins moving forward," she added. "Your father saw great promise in him." My chest tightened. I'd heard that line before. When I was passed over for promotion, when I was told to step back from meetings, when Dad started inviting Trevor on business trips instead of me. The doorbell rang sharp and cold. "That must be Harold," Sandra chirped. "Let's get this done, shall we?" I followed them into the study, what used to be Dad's library. His books were gone and replaced by modern art and glass vases. Even the leather chair he loved had vanished. As they handed me a pen, I looked down at the forms. A line caught my eye. "Property transfer agreement," it read. And beneath it, my name. With a blank space next to it waiting for my signature. They expected me to sign away what little was left of my father's legacy. But they didn't know I had already signed something else. And it was going to change everything. I stared at the signature line like it was a trap, because it was. They'd dressed it up in legal jargon and polite smiles, but I knew exactly what this was: erasure in ink. Sandra tapped the pen against the folder, her perfectly manicured nails clicking in rhythm. "It's all standard," she said. "You'll be compensated, of course." "Compensated?" I repeated, my voice low. Trevor chimed in, tone smug. "Come on, Chloe. It's not as if you were ever truly involved. You moved on, remember, left all this behind." He gestured toward the windows as if he owned the land they looked out on. "I didn't move on," I said. "I was pushed out." His smirk deepened. "Same thing." My hand tightened around the pen. Because he wasn't wrong about one thing I had left. But not because I didn't care. I left because no one seemed to care that I stayed. When my father married Sandra, I tried to be understanding. I was 23. She was glamorous, polished, everything the local country club adored. Dad seemed happy. That should have been enough. But slowly the house changed. My voice at board meetings grew smaller. My ideas, once praised, were now too ambitious. Sandra began sitting in on operations meetings, asking pointed questions she pretended were innocent. Then came the interns. The boys she brought in, mentored, praised. Trevor among them. The kid didn't know a yield curve from a garden hose, but he had the last name she wanted on the door. I remember one meeting in particular just a few months before I left. We were reviewing expansion plans for a second feed plant. I had spent weeks on the proposal. I ran every number twice. Dad nodded as I presented but didn't say a word. When I finished, Sandra leaned forward and said, "Interesting, but wouldn't it make more sense to keep things simple?" Trevor had a great idea about outsourcing instead. Trevor beamed. I deflated. Dad said nothing. That silence hurt more than any insult could have. Now here I was, years later, standing in the room where they'd rewritten the family legacy without me. And they expected me to make it official. I didn't sign. Instead, I placed the pen down, gently stood, and said, "I'll need to review this with my attorney." Sandra's smile didn't flicker. "Of course, dear. Take all the time you need. It doesn't change what's already been decided." She thought this was a formality. She thought I was cornered. But she had no idea what was coming. Because tucked deep in my carry-on inside an envelope with gold foil trim was the document my father had signed just 6 months before he died. Not a will. A contract. And the ink was still sharp enough to cut. The guest house smelled like lavender and distance. Everything inside was sterile white sheets, perfectly folded towels, a fake orchid on the nightstand. A place meant for visitors. Temporary. Not for daughters. I dropped my bag and sat on the edge of the bed, letting the silence settle. Outside the window, I could see the main house lit up like a showroom. Somewhere in there, Sandra was probably pouring a glass of Chardonnay, celebrating another small victory. Trevor would be bragging about how smoothly things were moving forward. They thought it was over. That I'd nod politely, maybe cry a little, and vanish again like a shadow they didn't have to claim. But I didn't come back for closure. I came back for the truth. I opened my bag and pulled out the envelope creamstock, thick embossed with the Carter family seal. Inside a notarized property agreement dated just 6 months ago. My father's signature was inked cleanly next to mine. It transferred ownership of 5 major real estate parcels, retail farmland, and the feed plant to me. No trust, no conditions. It's just a clean legal transaction. That was the man I knew. Quiet, methodical. A planner. And yet he never told anyone. Why sign everything over to me? And say nothing? I stared at his signature, my chest heavy with questions that would never be answered. Did he regret pushing me away? Was this his version of an apology? Or just strategy? Another move on the chessboard of legacy? My phone buzzed a message from a number I didn't recognize. "Hey, this is Marcy from bookkeeping. I heard you were in town. We should talk." I froze. Marcy had been with Carter Agritech for over 2 decades. Sharp, loyal, and quietly observant. If she was reaching out now, it meant something was off. I texted back quickly. "Tomorrow morning." 9 a.m., Cafe Bricks perfect, she replied. I leaned back against the headboard, replaying every moment of the day. The fake sympathy. The forms. The Rolex on Trevor's wrist. How long had this been happening? How deep did it go? I thought about Dad's voice, how he used to say paperwork is power, Chloe. Never underestimate the pen. He was right, and he gave me the one thing they never expected: control. But now I needed more. I needed to know what they were hiding. Why were they so desperate to push me out so quick to seal the doors? Something told me this wasn't just about family pride. It was about money and secrets. And tomorrow I'd find out just how far they were willing to go to keep both. The next morning, Cafe Bricks was quiet, just the hum of the espresso machine and the soft shuffle of old jazz through the speakers. I chose a booth in the back, where sunlight filtered in through warped window glass, painting golden squares on the table. Marcy walked in right on time, still in her gray cardigan, still clutching her worn leather planner like a shield. She spotted me and gave a small wave, her face taut. "You came back," she said, sliding into the seat across from me. Apparently, I replied. "And from the look on your face, I was right, too." She didn't waste time. "They've been selling off pieces of the business," she said. Quietly, behind closed doors. It started a year ago, minor assets and out-of-use equipment. But recently, they began discussing the feed plant. And the downtown lots. The feed plant. The one Dad and I built up from scratch. The one now sitting in my name. "They can't sell it," I said slowly. "They don't own it anymore." Marcy raised an eyebrow. "They think they do." She opened her planner and slid a folded piece of paper toward me. I recognized the document instantly, a development proposal with fake board signatures. "They forged approval documents," she whispered. "And they've already been in contact with buyers, out-of-state developers." I stared at the paper, my fingers curling. They're prepping the narrative, she added, painting you as absent disinterested. They've been calling you estranged in internal meetings, saying you gave up your claim years ago. My chest burned, not with surprise, but with confirmation. I thought of Trevor's smugness, of Sandra's false condolences. They were working overtime to make sure no one saw me as legitimate. They wanted me gone, erased. But I had something they didn't count on: proof, my father's signature on legally binding deeds. Still, something didn't sit right. Why now, I asked. Why move so fast? Marcy leaned in. Because the estate's running dry. They've drained most of the liquid assets. It's all been going into Sandra's accounts. Offshore. The words felt like ice down my spine. And your father, she said quietly. He wasn't in control of his accounts for months before he passed. Sandra had power of attorney. I sat back cold all over. This wasn't just betrayal. This was theft. This was a fraud. And if I didn't act soon, they'd bury the rest of my father's legacy beneath fake signatures and fast deals. I looked down at the deed contract in my bag, then back at Marcy. I need a lawyer, I said. A good one. She nodded once. I know just the guy. Outside the window, a bird landed on the sill, cocked its head, and flew off. And I knew this wasn't going to be about forgiveness. This was going to be about justice. I drove back to the ranch with the windows down, letting the cool morning air cut through the fog in my chest. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, but I needed to feel something solid beneath them. The cafe conversation with Marcy replayed in loops: Sandra draining accounts, forged signatures, power of attorney. I shouldn't have been surprised. But I was. Not because they were capable of it, but because Dad let them. It made me sick to think he might have spent his final months powerless, watched over by people who smiled in public and schemed in silence. I pulled off the main road and turned onto the gravel drive leading to the ranch, slowing as I passed the barn. It looked smaller now, still freshly painted, still standing tall, but something about it felt hollow. Like it knew it had been stolen too. Inside the guest house, I spread the documents out on the table. Deeds, contracts, transaction records Marcy had printed. I took photos of everything, emailed copies to a secure folder, and started building the story piece by piece. Then I called the number she'd given me. A man named Bill Harlow answered, a semi-retired attorney, a friend of Marcy's late husband, once represented farmers in land disputes against major corporations. His voice was gravelly and sharp. I told him everything in 10 minutes flat. "You're sitting on a live wire, Miss Carter," he said. "This isn't just a family squabble. This is financial fraud, probate manipulation, and possibly elder abuse. Can you help?" "I wouldn't miss it," he said. I hung up and felt something shift in my chest. Not quite relief, not yet. But something close. It's like stepping onto solid ground after treading water too long. Still, even with a lawyer on my side, I knew this fight would be brutal. Because it wasn't just about money or property. It was about control, appearance. And Sandra had built a world where she reigned without question. I thought back to the first time I noticed the change. It was the summer after Dad remarried. I was still living at home, trying to prove I could balance business and family. Sandra started joining us for dinner meetings, at first silent, then slowly guiding the conversation. Her voice was gentle but firm, measured. She'd lean over Dad's shoulder and whisper suggestions during presentations. One night I pitched a local supply partnership. I'd negotiated lower rates and higher margins. Dad was impressed. Until Sandra asked, "But wouldn't that look small time to national clients?" The deal was shelved. A week later, Trevor presented the exact numbers repackaged with a glossy brochure. Dad clapped. That was the night I realized influence didn't always come with a title. Sometimes it came with pearls, a polished smile, and a glass of wine held just right. But I had something now she didn't. Paper. Proof. And a growing list of people ready to speak. It was time to knock on the door they'd locked from the inside. I walked into the main house that afternoon. like I had every right to be there because I did. But the second my hand touched the doorknob, I could feel the shift, the tension, as if the walls themselves were bracing for a confrontation. Sandra was in the sunroom sipping tea from her favorite porcelain cup, the one she never let anyone else touch. She looked up startled for just a flicker of a second, before smoothing her expression into something calm and practiced. "Chloe," she said with feigned warmth. "You should have called." "I figured we're past small talk," I replied, stepping into the room. My eyes scanned the space, her designer throw pillows, curated flower arrangements, not a single photograph of me or my mother in sight. Just Trevor over and over, smiling beside my father like he belonged there from the beginning. "I spoke with Marcy," I said, watching her reaction. A subtle tightening around her eyes. She showed me the proposal, the forged board approvals. Sandra set her cup down carefully. "You shouldn't take gossip too seriously. Marcy's always been emotional." "That's not all," I continued. "I know about the offshore accounts, about the asset liquidation, the power of attorney you obtained when Dad wasn't in his right mind." She didn't flinch. She didn't deny it. Instead, she leaned back in her chair and smiled. "You always were dramatic, Chloe. That's why this company was never going to work with you in charge. It needed someone who understood discretion, stability. Like Trevor, I asked. He doesn't even know how to read a cash flow statement without Google." Sandra chuckled softly. "He doesn't need to. He has me." And there it was. She'd never wanted to be a wife or a stepmother. She wanted power. She just wore pearls and played hostess to get it. "You had your chance," she said, voice lowering. "But you were always too soft, too sentimental. This world isn't built for women who cry in meetings, Chloe. It's built for women who smile while they're being underestimated." I felt the sting in her words, not because they hurt, but because they used to. Not anymore. "I'm not crying now," I said quietly. Her eyes narrowed. "What exactly do you want to be heard?" I said. "And after that, to be seen." I turned and walked away. Before she could respond, every step deliberate, controlled. I didn't slam the door. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. Because what she didn't know was that I wasn't coming back alone. The papers were filed that morning. A motion to freeze the assets tied to the real estate deeds, my deeds. A lawsuit for breach of fiduciary duty. And by the end of the week, she'd be facing more than just my accusations. She'd be facing the law. That night, I found myself sitting in my old pickup truck parked just outside the town's courthouse. The building was dark now, locked for the day, but in the morning, it would become the battleground where my name would be put back on record. Not a problem, not as a mistake, but as an owner. My hands were steady, but my heart wasn't. Part of me still expected a voice my father's maybe to stop me, to ask if I was sure, to remind me how messy family and business could get. But that voice was gone. And silence, I'd learned, is often louder than words. Back at the guest house, I pulled out an old photo album I found buried under some boxes. It was dusty, forgotten. It's probably meant to be thrown out. Inside were pages of my childhood, me on Dad's shoulders, me helping him paint the barn, me at 10 years old, holding my first business plan, a lemonade stand expansion strategy that involved hiring my neighbor's kids. None of those pictures had ever been displayed on the living room walls. But they were real. And so was I. The next morning, the county clerk's office buzzed with quiet energy phones ringing, printers churning. I filed the lawsuit with Bill by my side. He handled the paperwork. I dealt with the history, a restraining order to freeze transactions on properties held under my name, a legal notice to Trevor and Sandra barring them from selling, modifying, or transferring assets until the matter was resolved, and a formal request to audit Carter Agritech's board activity over the last 3 years. By noon, the documents were officially stamped and copies couriered out. That same afternoon, Sandra called. I didn't answer. Instead, I went for a walk through downtown past the old feed store. Past the school I once thought I'd send my future kids, past the hardware store that still had a framed picture of Dad shaking hands with the mayor. People looked at me now, not as a ghost, but as someone who'd returned with purpose. A few nodded. One woman even whispered "good for you" as I passed. But it wasn't over. Back at the guest house, a car was parked outside. Trevor leaned against it, arms crossed, jaw tight. "We need to talk," he said. I opened the door but didn't step aside. "You mean now that I've blocked your sale?" I asked. His eyes flashed. "I didn't know," he said. "Not everything." "Sandra handled the paperwork." "Then you were either complicit or willfully blind," I replied. "Pick one." He paused, then held out a file folder. "What's this?" I asked. "Something you might want to see," he said. Inside were emails, printouts, dates, signatures, and one document that made my stomach drop. A revised will dated 2 weeks before Dad died. Not signed, not notarized. However, it was written to exclude me completely. Sandra hadn't just stolen my father's trust. She'd tried to rewrite his final word. I sat alone at the kitchen table in the guest house, the folder from Trevor open in front of me. My fingers hovered over the unsigned will, my heart beating like a drum. The date on the document was impossible to ignore, just 14 days before Dad died. A will that removed my name altogether, redistributed everything to Sandra and her children, and labeled me only as estranged. But it wasn't signed. Not by my father. Not by a witness. Not by a notary. It was a draft typed cleanly but unfinished. And yet, it existed. The message was loud, even if it wasn't legal. Someone wanted to erase me not just from the company, not just from the house, but from my father's story. And I wasn't sure what scared me more, the thought that Sandra forged it, or the possibility that Dad had meant every word. I picked up the phone and called Bill. I told him about the document. The silence on the other end lasted longer than I liked. "Don't panic," he said finally. "It's not enforceable unless it's properly executed. However, we need to determine how far this extends. If Sandra had power of attorney, she could have tried pushing it through. Could have even manipulated the estate lawyer." My stomach turned. That would explain the rushed reading, the missing invitation, the look on Sandra's face when I walked through the door. They thought they had the last word. They didn't count on me still listening. Trevor was still outside, pacing beside his car. I stepped onto the porch and called his name. He turned surprised. "You read it?" I did. He looked away, shame flickering through his expression. "She made me print it. Said it was what Dad wanted. But he never signed it. Not in front of me, I swear. Did he read it? I don't know. He wasn't sharp those last few weeks. She controlled everything, his meds, his calls, his schedule. I don't even know if he saw it. I believed him. Mostly. But the damage was already done. "What made you bring it to me?" I asked. He hesitated, then said, "Because I saw what she was doing. And because I'm not sure who I am, without her telling me what to be." I didn't answer that. I didn't need to. Instead, I went back inside and added the draft will to my growing file of evidence. That night, I wrote a letter to my father. I told him everything. That I forgave him for choosing silence. That I was done staying small to keep the peace. That I was going to honor his legacy, but not the version Sandra sold. I folded the letter, placed it beside the old photo of us by the barn, and whispered a quiet promise into the dark. "You didn't sign that will, Dad. But I'm signing my name back into this family with ink no one can erase." The next morning, I got a call from the county clerk's office. Sandra had filed an emergency petition. She was trying to move the assets fast. The call came just after sunrise. My phone buzzed beside my coffee cup, vibrating against the silence like an alarm bell. It was the county clerk's office. "Miss Carter, you need to come in." Sandra Caldwell filed an emergency motion late last night. She's petitioning to transfer asset authority under a temporary business trust. She's claiming instability in the ownership structure. My stomach clenched. Instability. That was her angle now. Not fraud, not grief, but instability. She was painting me as irrational, volatile, unfit to handle what had been mine since my father signed those deeds. I arrived within the hour, legal file tucked under my arm heels, clicking across marble tile. The clerk behind the glass looked surprised. Maybe she expected someone messier, the estranged daughter, the one who ran. But I stood tall shoulders square, every step a reminder that I wasn't there to reclaim scraps. I was there to protect the legacy. Bill met me in the hallway, already reading through the filing. His eyes were sharp behind his glasses, voice low but certain. She's trying to pull an end run around the probate hold. If she gets this trust approved, she can move the assets offshore before we even finish discovery. And she thinks the court will buy it. She's banking on old assumptions, he said. That you're emotional, that you'll crack. I didn't crack. We entered the small courtroom together. The air cool and stale, the walls lined with the weight of decisions made quietly every day. Sandra sat on the opposite bench, dressed in mourning black, a veil lightly brushing her cheeks, as if she were auditioning for a Tennessee Williams revival. She didn't look at me. Her lawyer stood and made their argument that the company was at risk, that the board was divided, that Chloe Carter had reappeared after years of absence and was now acting erratically. They called me impulsive, unproven, a complicating element. Then Bill stood. He spoke with the quiet force of a man who'd been underestimated too many times. He presented the deeds, the notarized documents. The draft will without a signature include the emergency filings, the offshore accounts, and the suspicious timing. Then he passed the judge a letter. From Marcy, a sworn statement. In it, she detailed the manipulation. The locked doors, the medication changes. The days when my father sat in his chair, confused and quiet, while Sandra fielded every call and filtered every message. The judge didn't make a ruling that day. But as we stepped out into the sunlight, Bill turned to me and said, "She's scrambling now." That motion, it was desperation. I nodded. "She's afraid," I said. He looked over at me, his expression unreadable. "She should be." Back at the ranch, a black SUV waited in the driveway. Inside it, someone I hadn't seen in a decade, and he was holding something that could shatter the entire case. The black SUV was parked right in front of the guest house. Its tinted windows reflected the late morning sun, and for a second I couldn't see who was inside. But when the door opened and he stepped out, it felt like time slammed into reverse. Caleb Foster. My father's former business partner, the man who walked away from Carter Agritech a year before Sandra married my dad. Rumor back then was that Caleb and Dad had a falling out over the future of the company, something about changing priorities. I hadn't seen him since my college graduation. He'd given me a leather-bound planner with my initials embossed in gold. Now he held a thin metal briefcase. "Chloe," he said, voice rougher, older, but steady. "We need to talk." I let him in. No questions. We sat at the old kitchen table, me across from a man who once taught me how to read a balance sheet like it was a crime scene. He unlatched the case and slid a manila folder across the table. "Your dad came to see me 8 months before he passed," Caleb said. He looked tired, lost, said he didn't recognize his boardroom anymore. My chest tightened. I asked why he didn't fight back. "You know what he said?" Caleb's voice cracked just for a second. He said, "They've already turned her against me. If I pull too hard, I'll lose her completely." I swallowed hard. "He thought you blamed him for letting you go." "I did," I whispered. "He was trying to fix it," Caleb said, quietly. "The deeds you have. That was just phase 1. There's more. These," he tapped the folder, "are emails, drafts, voice memos. Your father's private communication with me and a few old allies. He was laying the groundwork to put you back in charge." I opened the folder. There it was. A memo titled "Carter Legacy Transition, July Timeline, Drafts of Shareholder Proposals," handwritten notes in Dad's exact scrawl. One page read, "Chloe has a vision." She always did. I see it now. A lump formed in my throat that wouldn't go down. He never got to finish it, Caleb said. Sandra had locked down every channel. He couldn't move without her knowing. I looked up. Why now? Why bring this to me now? Because I saw the court filing. I saw what Sandra was trying to do, and I've kept quiet long enough. He slid me one last envelope. Inside a USB drive. Everything's on here, he said. Emails, voice memos, and one video file. I looked at him stunned. He recorded it, I asked. Caleb nodded. 3 weeks before he died, the next morning I'd play that video. But tonight I'd sit alone and press the cold drive to my heart, knowing my father had spoken. And tomorrow, so would I, on the record. In court. For the whole town to hear. I sat in the dark, the only light coming from my laptop screen. The USB drive Caleb had given me blinked steadily like a pulse. I hesitated for just a moment, then clicked the file labeled Final Message. T. Carter. My father's face filled the screen. Pale. Thinner than I remembered. But his eyes, those eyes I inherited, were clear. If you're watching this, Chloe, then I couldn't say it out loud, or wasn't allowed to. He looked down, gathered himself, then continued. I know I failed you. I didn't protect your place here. I let fear and comfort dictate more than they should have. But you were always the one with vision, the one who challenged me. That terrified me, because it reminded me of myself before I got soft. He chuckled once, a tired, sad sound. I started the paperwork, the transfer, the deals with Caleb. I wanted it to be clean, legal. But Sandra, he paused. She knew how to make everything seem like it was for my benefit, even when it wasn't. I don't know how far she went, but if she's still there, you'll need help. Real help. And you'll need to fight. He looked straight into the camera. Don't let them erase you. You're Carter blood. You earned everything. The screen faded to black, and I sat there for a long time, staring at my reflection. It wasn't grief I felt. It was permission. The next morning, I marched into the courthouse with that video backed up 3 different ways. Bill was waiting already on the phone, coordinating with a probate investigator and the state bar. Marcy was outside holding a manila folder of internal memos she'd copied from the company server. Inside the hearing room, Sandra and her attorney sat poised, still smug, still calculating, until the footage played. Gasps. A judge leaning forward. Even Trevor, seated a row behind Sandra, dropped his head into his hands. My father's voice filled the chamber. Calm, firm, alive in the way truth always is. When it ended, no one spoke for several seconds. Then Bill stood. We move to challenge the existing estate documents formally and file for fraud. Sandra's lawyer stammered, asked for recess, said the video was unverified, but it was too late. The judge turned to me. Miss Carter, do you have any further documentation of your legal stake in these properties? I opened my bag and laid out every deed, notarized transfer, and contract my father had signed before his health declined. Yes, Your Honor, I said. I have everything. And for the first time since I stepped back into this town, no one told me I didn't belong. Outside the courtroom, reporters were already gathering. But I wasn't done. Not until every stone Sandra tried to bury me under was lifted into daylight. The courthouse doors swung shut behind me, sealing in the echo of my father's voice still hanging in the air. I stood on the steps for a moment, sunlight warming my shoulders, heart pounding like I'd just run a marathon. But this wasn't the finish line. It was just the first real mile. Reporters were already gathering, scribbling notes and snapping photos. Some asked for statements, but I kept walking. Let them speculate. Let the silence speak for itself for now. Back at the guest house, I spread everything out across the dining table like a general mapping out a battle strategy. Legal files, corporate records, the video, the affidavits. It wasn't just about defending what was mine anymore. It was about exposure, correction, truth. Because what Sandra did wasn't just personal, it was systemic. She didn't just steal from me. She corrupted a legacy, coerced an older man, manipulated an institution built on my grandfather's handshake deals and my father's word, and the town. They were starting to talk. 2 calls came in that afternoon. One from a former board member who admitted under oath they'd been pressured into signing off on property sales they didn't fully understand. The other was from a local journalist, Lindsay Harper, who had covered Carter Agritech for years. She asked for an interview. "People want to hear your side," she said. "Not yet," I told her. "Soon." Because before I spoke to the press, I had one more stop to make. The Carter Company building still looked the same: glass walls, modern stone, and a fountain in front that cost more than my first car. But inside, everything had shifted. I walked past the receptionist, who blinked, but didn't stop me. Past Trevor's office, where the blinds were now drawn. Past the wall of executive portraits, where my father's frame hung, still centered, still proud. I pushed open the double doors to the boardroom. Empty. But not for long. I placed copies of my documentation at every seat, totaling 10. Then I set the video file to autoplay on the large screen. And beside the head chair, I placed one photo. Just one. Me and Dad arm in arm in front of the original feed plant hard hats, on sweat on our brows. The caption he once wrote in pen still showed faintly on the bottom corner, "Built from the ground up." Just like her. I sat at the far end of the table, not at the head. Not yet. That seat would be earned again publicly, properly. But for now, I sat in the room they once locked me out of, and waited. Because the board was meeting. At 10 a.m., and this time I wouldn't need to raise my voice to be heard. I had something louder. Evidence, legacy, and soon votes. The boardroom slowly filled one cautious face after another. Men and women I'd known since childhood, family friends, former mentors, people who once ruffled my hair or ignored my presence altogether. They sat shifting uncomfortably, glancing toward the empty chair at the head of the table. And then the screen lit up. My father's video began to play just as I'd planned. The room went silent. No phones, no side chatter. Just his voice, clear and steady, echoing off the walls that had once shut me out. One of the board members, Mr. Halford, looked down at his notes halfway through, but not before I caught the flicker of guilt in his eyes. When the screen went black, I stood. I know most of you remember me as the girl who fetched coffee during board meetings I began, or maybe as the hothead who questioned too many decisions. A few chuckled nervously. But today I'm here not just with memories, but with proof. Legal, personal, and moral. I passed out updated copies of the property transfers letters from Marcy and my father's transition plan. Caleb had added his statement notarized and signed detailing the meetings he had with Dad about restoring me to the business. This company wasn't just built by Carter's hands, I said. It was built on Carter's integrity. And we've lost that. I paused. Sandra Caldwell breached that integrity. She weaponized access-controlled communication and misrepresented the company's leadership. That's not a strategy, that's sabotage. I looked each of them in the eye. I'm not here to burn it down, I'm here to rebuild it the right way. With people who remember why we started. Why my father started. Halford cleared his throat. We didn't know how far it had gone. You didn't want to know, I corrected gently, because it was easier to believe the version of me that made less noise. There was silence. Then a woman named Darlene, who'd sat quietly for years under Sandra's thumb, spoke up. I vote we call an emergency shareholder meeting, she said. Today. Others nodded. It was happening. Not out of pity. Not because I made them feel guilty. But because truth, when spoken with clarity, is hard to look away from. And I had shown them more than facts. I had shown them what legacy looked like when it refused to be erased. As the board filed out to prepare for the vote, I lingered by the chair at the head of the table. I didn't sit yet. Not until it was mine by decision, not just blood. In the hallway, I caught a glimpse of Sandra through the glass. Her smile was gone. And this time she wasn't holding the pen. I was. The shareholder meeting was called within hours. Word had spread fast, too fast for Sandra to contain it. I could almost picture her at home, pacing in her silk robe, dialing every board member's number with that icy calm she used when things slipped out of her grasp. But it was already done. People showed up in person. Others joined by video call. Retired partners. Minor stakeholders, even the silent investors, the ones who never spoke a word at annual meetings, leaned in now. Because scandal changes the air, it makes even the complacent curious, and I gave them something to look at. I stood at the front of the room, no podium, no notes, and let the truth speak. My father believed in legacy, I said. He built Carter Agritech with a handshake of vision and a stubbornness I inherited. But legacy isn't just buildings and profits. It's how you treat people when they stop clapping. There were nods, a few lowered eyes. I took a deep breath. I was shut out of this company, this family, this story, not because I wasn't qualified, but because I made the mistake of questioning the wrong people. That ends today. I laid out the timeline, the deeds, the offshore transfers, the forged drafts. Sandra used the power of attorney like a weapon. I played the video again for those who hadn't seen it. My father's voice wrapped around the room like a benediction. You could hear breathing change. You could feel hearts realign. When it ended, no one moved. Then Halford stood up. I call for a motion to reinstate Chloe Carter as majority shareholder representative. Seconded, thirded, and then the vote. It wasn't unanimous, but it was enough. As the gavel hit the table, officially recognizing me as the legal and operational lead of Carter Agritech, I didn't feel triumphant, not in the way movies teach you to expect. No swelling music. No tears. Just stillness. Like a room finally cleared of smoke. Then came the hard part. Cleanup. We initiated a forensic audit. Sandra's accounts were frozen. Her position was revoked. Trevor stepped down quietly, handing over access codes and passwords with a look I couldn't quite decipher. Regret maybe, or just exhaustion. I didn't gloat. I didn't fire half the team. I rebuilt. Carefully. Fairly. Because power taken by force crumbles fast, but power earned that stays. The company newsletter went out the next day with a single headline: Back to our roots. Back to Carter. And as I stood in my father's old office, now mine, I opened the bottom drawer. Inside, untouched, was the planner he gave me when I was 22. A note slipped in the front pocket. Led like you mean it, kiddo. And now I finally could. But the past hadn't finished speaking. Because just when I thought the house was clean, an anonymous tip arrived. One that pointed toward a final betrayal hidden deeper than I ever expected. The envelope was plain. No return address. Just my name, handwritten in thin, deliberate strokes across the front. It was left with the front desk, no signature, no message. But inside it carried a storm. A stack of printed emails. Scans of old checks. And a note. You need to see what she did to your mother's estate. A friend. I sat in the office alone. The building quiet after hours, the windows casting long, solemn shadows. My hands trembled as I unfolded the first sheet. It was a payment trail. From Carter family accounts. To a private firm that specializes in estate liquidation. The dates, just 2 months after my mother died. 2 months later, my father remarried Sandra. And the property, my mother's lake cabin. The one she left to me in her will. The one I thought had been sold during the recession to cover debts. Except it hadn't. It had been transferred. Quietly. To a shell company. Then to Sandra. Sold 3 years later at 5 times the price. And no one told me. I stood up too fast, knocking my chair back. For all the theft I thought I had uncovered, this one hurt differently. It was personal in a way Sandra's other schemes weren't. This wasn't just financial. It was about memory. Legacy. Love. That lake cabin was where my mom and I had spent our last summer together, where she told me to be brave, to never shrink for anyone, where she made me promise I'd never settle for being tolerated in a room I helped build. And Sandra had turned it into a profit line. I scanned through the rest of the papers, bile rising in my throat. She'd used my father's name on some of the transfers, likely forged, or worse, coerced signatures when he was too lost in grief to understand. She'd erased my mother, too. Bill confirmed everything the next morning. He traced the paper trail to a trust in the Cayman Islands, one of several Sandra had created during her marriage. She planned this from the start, he said. This wasn't survival, it was strategy. We filed an emergency motion to investigate the illegal transfer of estate assets. This time not through Carter Agritech, but through federal fraud and inheritance courts. Sandra was served at her temporary residence. Cameras caught her hiding behind dark sunglasses, refusing to answer questions. She'd gone from polished matriarch to pariah in a week. But I didn't feel vindicated. I felt hollow. Because justice doesn't always bring peace. Sometimes it just confirms the betrayal was worse than you imagined. Still, I pressed forward. Because the next hearing was scheduled. And this time it wouldn't be about business. It would be about my mother, her memory, and what it meant to reclaim everything that was stolen truly. The courtroom was smaller than the one for the corporate case. No glossy benches, no cameras waiting outside. Just soft carpet, oak-paneled walls, and the weight of grief betrayal, and the quiet power of a mother's memory. I sat in the front row, hands folded in my lap, the documents laid out neatly beside me. Across the aisle, Sandra sat alone. There is no team of attorneys, no smug glances, just silence. For the first time, she looked small. I'm not humbled, just exposed. The judge entered, adjusted his glasses, and opened the file. We're here today to review the motion regarding the alleged illegal transfer of property belonging to the late Mary Carter, he said, filed by her daughter, Chloe Carter. I stood. My voice didn't shake. My mother left that cabin to me. It was never about the value, it was about the history, about who we were before all this. Sandra Caldwell sold that memory for profit. She didn't just erase my name from a deed. She erased my mother's handwriting, the sound of her laughter on the porch, the book she left on the shelf. I paused. Let it breathe. She turned our grief into currency, and now she has to answer for it. Bill stepped in with the legal facts, the chain of title, the signature inconsistencies, the sudden offshore trust Sandra had created weeks after marrying my father. Then came the voice recording. Not my father's this time, but my mother's. A voicemail I hadn't listened to in years. It was found buried in an old backup. Chloe, I've updated the will. You'll get the cabin. Please take your kids there someday. Tell them about the dock, about the night we saw the meteor shower. It's yours, sweetheart. Don't let them tell you otherwise. You could hear the tears in her voice. You could feel her presence. Even the judge paused. Sandra didn't speak. Not a single word in her defense. She just stared ahead blankly. The judge ruled in my favor. Full restitution of the sale value, investigation into Sandra's misuse of inherited property, and a formal recognition of the emotional damages done. But I didn't care about the check. I cared about one thing. That memory was mine again. The following week, I drove out to the cabin. The new owners had agreed to sell it back at cost. They'd read the story in the paper. Some things shouldn't be bought, the man said, handing me the keys. I unlocked the door, stepped into the dust and silence, and breathed in something I thought I'd lost. Home. The curtains were gone. The porch swing creaked, but I could still hear her voice in the walls. I sat on the floor back against the wood paneling and whispered, "We made it, Mom." But I wasn't finished yet, because I hadn't faced the town, and I hadn't told my story, not to the people who needed to hear it most. 3 weeks later, I stood behind the podium at the Hill County Rotary Luncheon, the same one I used to serve lemonade at when I was 14. Now I was back as the keynote speaker. The invitation had come from Darlene, the same board member who once doubted I could manage a budget, let alone a legacy. "It's time the town heard from the real Carter," she'd said. The room was packed. Business owners, teachers, retired couples who'd read the headlines, former employees who'd left quietly after the merger. Some curious, some skeptical. But they were listening. I took a deep breath. When I left Hill County 7 years ago, I didn't think I'd return. At least not like this. Back then I was told I was too emotional to lead, too young to understand, too attached to history to see the future. I paused and let the words settle. But sometimes history is the very thing that saves us. It reminds us who we are and who we are not. I told them everything. Not just the court wins, the assets, the facts. I told them about my mom's voice in that voicemail, about the night I found the unsigned will, about the time I sat alone in a car outside Carter Agritech wondering if I had imagined my place in the story. And for a while I admitted I believed I didn't belong, because when enough people look through you, you start to wonder if you're even there. I looked around the room, but here's the thing, they didn't erase me. They just postponed me. And I came back with receipts, with records, and with something stronger than all of it, clarity. A few claps broke out, then more. I didn't come back to reclaim a company. I came back to restore a name, not just mine. My father's, my mother's. The kind of Carter legacy built on sweat, fairness, and showing up especially when it's hard. I wrapped up with this: if you've ever been made to feel small, invisible, or replaceable, let this be your reminder. Legacy isn't given. It's taken back. Standing ovation. Some cried. Some stood in quiet reflection. But they all saw me. As I walked off stage, a teenage girl approached. Soft-spoken, nervous. My dad said I couldn't take over his shop one day because I'd probably marry out of town. But after hearing you, I think I'm going to ask him again. I smiled and handed her my card. "Don't ask," I said. "Plan." I stepped outside into the Texas sunlight, warm and heavy with memory. But there was one more place I needed to go. One last conversation I had avoided since the day I came back. The gravestone on the hill where my family rested. And the apology I had to give, not to them, but to myself. The hill was quiet. I parked just past the old cemetery gate and walked the narrow gravel path. Sun warm on my shoulders, wind teasing the loose strands of hair at my neck. In my hand, I held a single photo, me and my parents, at the lake cabin, all squinting smiles and wind-tangled hair. The kind of photo that had no frame, just memory. I stopped at the headstone. Mary Carter, beloved wife, fierce mother. Thomas Carter, visionary, flawed, father. I knelt and laid the photo gently at the base. No speech, no rehearsed words, just breath, stillness. I kept my promise, I whispered. I came back. I didn't let them erase us. There was no reply, of course, but the silence felt different now, less like absence, more like presence, like memory had stepped out of the past and taken its rightful place beside me. I stood brushing the dust from my jeans, my heart steady in a way I hadn't felt in years. Everything had changed. Sandra had been indicted for fraud, and her assets had been seized. Trevor moved out of state, out of the business, out of the shadow he'd never earned. And me, I didn't just reclaim Carter Agritech. I rebuilt it. We launched new initiatives for local farmers, created scholarships in my mother's name, and opened a community grant fund. But more than that, we changed the culture. We made space for voices like mine, voices like the ones I used to silence in myself, just to be easier to manage. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about restoration. Because I realized something in that courtroom and again on that podium and now on this hill, the goal was never to prove them wrong. It was to prove me right. That was enough. That I always had been. Sometimes justice doesn't roar. It whispers. It grows slowly like roots deepening beneath scorched earth. and when it finally blooms, it doesn't ask for applause. It just is. As I turned to leave, I looked back one last time. The wind lifted the corner of the photo, and for a moment it looked like we were waving. I smiled. Walked on. Final echo. That evening, I unlocked the door to the lake cabin, now mine again. The air inside smelled like wood-old dreams, and something new like peace. I lit a candle, sat on the porch, and watched the stars come out just like we used to. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was trying to get back to something. I was home. If this story moved you, if you've ever had to fight to be heard, subscribe to catch more inspiring stories. You never know whose silence is waiting to be broken.